The water had been flowing for 19 years and 3 months, and Pieter Van Doren stood beside it at noon, pruning a dead branch from his second youngest apple sapling. The branch came away with a single twist. The heat had killed it in the 3rd week of August, the same week it had killed the cottonwood grove along the dry creek 2 miles east. Pieter set the branch beside the others and turned the iron dipper into the trough. The trough was 8 feet long and held 80 gallons of water. It had been overflowing since dawn. Behind him, the Halladay wheel turned at 3 rotations a minute in a 10-mile breeze. Above the trough, the iron pump rod climbed and fell with the steadiness of a slow heartbeat, and from its spout the water came in a thread the thickness of a man's thumb that had not stopped for 14 months of the worst drought the high plains had seen since the homesteads first opened. He poured the dipper around the sapling's root ball. The water vanished into the dust like a coin into deep water, but he knew where it would surface again, 18 inches down, in the 4-inch glazed clay tile he had buried in the spring of 6th, spreading sideways through the soil to the roots of every living plant in the 30-foot oasis around the windmill base. 700 square feet of green and a county the color of bone. To the south, on the road, buggy wheels. Pieter knew the sound. He had heard it 3 times that month. J.W. Fenwick reined in his black mare at the gate. The buggy was dust-coated to the hubs. Fenwick was 47 and prosperous. His coat was good wool and his eyes were the color of dry sky. He did not get down. Mr. Van Doren. Mr. Fenwick. $6 an acre. Last week it was 4. Last week the McCready place was still standing. They went out yesterday. 3 families have signed in 8 days. Fenwick paused. He was a man who had practiced his silences. You're sitting on the only running water in 3 counties, old man. I can make you wealthy. Your other choice is angry neighbors. And angry neighbors do things. Pieter looked at the apple sapling. He had grown this one from a seed his brother had sent from Lancaster the year Anika died. It was 8 years old now and just beginning to bear. This place was never for sale, Mr. Fenwick. It was for waiting. Fenwick's mouth tightened. He had heard the answer at every visit. He gathered the reins. There are men in this county who do not know the word patience, Van Doren. You may want to consider that. He drove off in his own dust. A quarter hour later, on the same road, Hank Fenwick rode past on a bay gelding gone too thin for the heat. Hank was 32. He had called Pieter a fool the first time at the age of 12 and at every age since. He saw Pieter at the trough and grinned without warmth. Heard my pa offered you 6. You're a fool twice over now, Dutchman. Pieter dipped the bucket and watered the next sapling. He did not look up. When the hoofbeats faded, he stood for a long minute with his hand against the wooden tower leg, feeling the small, steady tremor of the pump rod through the timber. Above him, the wheel turned. Below him, in the buried tile, the water moved without sound toward the corn and the squash and the 4 young apple trees. He had been called a fool for 20 years. He had grown patient with the word. In the morning, he saddled the mule and rode the 2.5 miles north to Walt Henley's claim. Henley was 61 and had broken his sod the same year Pieter had drilled his well. His house was good built, his fences kept. His hand-dug well was 32 feet deep, and it had been dry 6 weeks. Pieter found him in the barn shade, mending a harness he would not need. Henley's 7 head of cattle had been sold the month before. Only the milk cow was left, and she stood with her hide loose on her bones. I have come to tell you to write to Mathers in Topeka, Pieter said. Cable tool driller. Honest man. He will come if you send the letter today. Henley set down the harness. He went into the house and came back with his ledger, opened it on a barrel, and turned it for Pieter to read. The last entry was $11.40, in a hand that had once been firm. Below it, in pencil, interest due Fenwick, Sept 14, $7.20. You think I do not know? Henley said quietly. I knew in 75 your way was the right way. I knew in 78. I have known every year since. Mathers wants $100 before he sets a tripod on my ground. He closed the ledger softly. I am not a beggar, Peter. Not yet. Peter said the only honest thing he could. If you bring buckets, I will fill them. Every morning. And how many of us, Pieter? 60 families in this township. 80 gallons a day for a household and stock. That is 4,800 gallons. Your mill gives 600. Henley smiled, and the smile had no anger in it. You cannot save us. You can only embarrass us. Go home and water your apples. Peter rode south. At the Mendel's homestead, the answer came faster. Mendel's did not even step out of his shaded doorway to take it. At the Halladay place, a child watched him from the porch and did not wave. He rode home through the noon heat. On the way back, passing the Fenwick fence line, the year-old voice came back to him uninvited. As the past will when a road repeats itself, Hank one summer evening, last June, leaning over that very fence as Peter greased the windmill head bearing, "Still tinkering, Van Doren? When you gonna actually farm?" He had not answered then. He could not answer now. The arithmetic was the same arithmetic. That evening he sat on the wooden bench beside his trough and watched the sun go orange across the cracked plain. The trough kept overflowing. The water moved through the tile to the corn and would move through the night, with no man's hand on it. He had built a thing that worked, and it was not enough to save the people who had laughed at him for building it. He thought, for the first time in years, perhaps it has all been for nothing. The wheel above him answered nothing. It only turned. He had decided in the spring of 1860, at the counter of Garden City General Mercantile, with 230 silver and paper dollars in a leather pouch and the Topeka driller's printed contract under his hand. He had been 48 then. Aneka was 44 and silent at his elbow. The contract asked for his mark. He held the pen and could not bring it down. 20 years of saving. Egg money, cured pork money, Lancaster County millwright wages from when he was young, pressed flat in tin boxes for a quarter century. $230 was the entire sum of his patience made visible, and the form on the counter wanted to take it all. On a single afternoon, for a hole in the ground and a wooden contraption from a Connecticut works he had only read about. It was then that his father came back to him, not as a ghost, as a memory exact enough to be sound. He was 13 years old again in Friesland in the rain. His father Hendrik stood at the foot of a poldermolen, a Frisian polder mill, 4 great cloth sails the size of barn doors, draining the low fields into the canal. Hendrik was 60 and had been a Molinamore, a mill tender, for 40 years. He was teaching young Pieter how to reef the sails before a coming squall. "You see why we climb up?" Hendrik had said, ropes in his teeth. "Because we must. Because the wind is too much for the cloth, and a man's hands are the only brake." In the storm of 1820, the apprentice at Sneek did not climb fast enough. The sails caught wrong and the mill broke its own back, and the boy went with it. "Een man vermoeit work. A man tires work," Pieter had asked with the directness of 13. Why no one had built a mill that climbed for itself? Hendrik had laughed without scorn. "Because no one yet knows how. But someone will, Pieter. Someone clever. The wind has no muscle to ache. The wind does not ask why. The wind keeps a promise it never made, to move, always, somewhere. And the man who builds the right shape across that promise becomes free of his own back. Windward, no wait, mow. Aline Mensen. Wind never tires. Only men do." In 1854, 29 years after that lesson, Peter had read in the Lancaster Examiner of a Mr. Daniel Halladay of Connecticut who had patented a self-governing wind wheel. Centrifugal weights, sails that closed themselves when the wind grew too strong. A machine that had stood untended in a field for 6 months without a hand laid on it. His father had been dead 3 years by then. Peter had sat with the newspaper a long time before folding it. Now, 6 years later, in a Kansas mercantile, the contract waited under his hand. He took the merchant's piece of charcoal and worked the figures in the margin, where an he could see. $5 hand-dug well, 5 years of life, then redig. 10 redigs over 50 years was $50. At 18,250 days of pumping by hand, 4 strokes to the gallon, 600 gallons asked of the well every dry summer day. $230, he wrote, or a lifetime with strokes. The cheap option is the dear one. Aniki read the figures. She put her hand on his wrist and said nothing. He signed. He turned and met the eyes of J.W. Fenwick, then 38, in a fine wool coat across the store. 12-year-old Hank stood at his father's hip. J.W. read the contract aloud over Peter's shoulder, loud enough for the store to hear. $230 for a hole in the ground, he said, and laughed a hard laugh. My boy could dig you one for 50 cents and a sandwich. Pieter Van Doren, fool with a contraption. Hank, 12, laughed along. Fool with a contraption. The phrase would follow Peter 20 years. He took the contract and walked out into the spring sun. The driller was R.B. Mathers of Topeka, 53, a man with a tripod and 2 laborers and a string of oxen. He arrived on the 1st of May, 1860, charged $99 for 180 feet at 55 cents the foot, a rate accepted because Pieter would work the surface tackle himself. For 18 days, the cable tool's sputter rose and fell on its rope. Days 1 to 3, hard pan to 36 feet. Days 4 to 9, clay layer through to 78 feet. 6 feet a day, slow. Days 10 to 15, the tool struck the sandstone of the Ogallala Formation. For that region, with its confined aquifer beneath 200 feet of layered clay and shale, and entered standing water at 95 feet below the surface. Days 16 to 18 drill clean to the static level into the confined zone. Total depth 180 feet. 6-inch riveted iron casing was lowered in 18 10-foot sections. Mathers took his money and drove east. Peter had ordered the Halladay wheel from the U.S. Wind Engine and Pump Company at Batavia, Illinois, $50 by mail, and the brass cylinder pump from a Pittsburgh foundry, $25 more. He had ordered 90 feet of 4-inch glazed drainage tile from a Kansas City brickyard, $35. He had cut his tower lumber from a standing cottonwood grove on the claim, and laid in $20 of pine for the wheel hub and the tail vane. The remaining dollar bought a pound of carriage bolts. The tower he built alone with a Polish neighbor's boy, paid in eggs, over the months of June, July, and August. 4 legs of cottonwood, base spread 14 feet square, top spread 4 feet square, total height 35 feet, 15 feet taller than any cottonwood standing within half a mile, so that the wind would reach the wheel clean. 6 horizontal cross brace levels at 5-foot intervals, diagonal X-pattern bracing on all 4 faces, 24 3/4-inch carriage bolts at every joint, mortise tenon shoulders on the leg posts, doubled with iron strapping. He knew from his father's stories of the sneak storm that a tower can lose itself faster than the wheel that crowns it. He set a 5th diagonal across each corner where his Halladay manual asked only for 4. The wheel came in crates. 20 wooden blades, each 4.5 feet long, 6 inches wide, 3/4 of an inch thick, hinged at the rim, linked at the hub to 4 cast iron governor weights of 1.5 pounds each on 18-inch ball arms. A rigid tail vane of pine, 8 feet long and 2 feet wide, painted with the white Halladay lettering that company agents required of all sold mills. He raised the assembly in sections in October, hoisted by block and tackle, and held by the same neighbor's boy. The pinion and crank had transferred the wheel's rotation to vertical reciprocating motion in the 7/8-inch iron sucker rod. The rod descended 180 feet through the tower's central axis to the brass cylinder set at 110 feet, 15 feet below the static water level, deep enough that drought drawdown could not lift the cylinder dry. He commissioned the mill at dawn on the 22nd of October, 1860. In a wind from the south-southwest measured at his weather flag at 11 miles per hour. The wheel turned, the rod climbed and fell. The cylinder filled, opened, expelled, refilled. After 14 seconds, the first thread of water struck the spout and entered the new wooden trough. He let it run 24 hours. By the next dawn, it had pumped 487 gallons. The low design, but real. In the spring of 1861, he and Ananka buried the irrigation tile. 4 spokes, 22 feet each, 88 feet of glazed clay total, butt jointed without mortar so that water could seep laterally from each foot-long section. Trenches dug 18 inches deep at a 2% grade away from the trough. Beds covered 4 inches of gravel, 14 inches of topsoil. They worked 6 weeks. Aniki's hands blistered and bled and calloused before the last spoke closed. In June, they planted corn in the northeast quadrant, squash southeast, beans southwest, potatoes northwest. 4 apple saplings from an Iowa nursery at the 30-foot perimeter. 700 square feet of cultivated ground around a steady wooden tower, in a county where most homesteaders had given up on gardens by July. Total cost when the last bolt was set, $230. Total time, 14 months. He was 49 when it was finished. The mill was 3 months old. That first winter he lay awake, listening for the wheel. When the wind dropped after midnight, the mill went quiet and the silence woke him as surely as a sound. He learned to read the night by what the windmill said. A slow creak meant a breeze of 7 miles. A steady whisper meant 10. A long high whine meant a storm closing from the west, and the governor weights flinging themselves outward to feather the blades. Some men learn to read horses. Pieter learned to read the air above his roof. The first dry spell came in the summer of 1864, 3 months without rain. Caleb Whitcomb's hand-dug well, 2 miles east on the river bluff, dropped 7 feet that July. By August, he was hauling from the Cimarron with a 2-mule team and lost a mule to colic on the road. Sam Mendel's well dropped 6 feet and went brackish. Elsbeth Holloway's well went dry on the 8th of August, and she packed her 3 children into a wagon and drove east to her sister in Missouri, never to return. Pieter's own static water dropped 2 feet. The cylinder, set 15 feet below the static level, never breathed air. The mill pumped 600 gallons every windy day through that summer and through the fall, and the apple saplings, 3 years old then, survived their first crisis without losing a leaf. 2 neighbors came to ask how. He told them. Neither had $100 for the driller and Halladay's mill in any case. They went home to dig a few more feet by hand and to hope. Aniki died in the cholera summer of 1872. She had ridden into Garden City for the Reverend Holcomb's funeral and drunk from the town pump that the Reverend had been drinking from before he died. Pieter's deep well water, drawn from a confined aquifer 110 feet below any surface contamination, was clean as snowmelt, and it could not save her. He sat with her through the 6 days. The wheel turned outside the bedroom window. When she went, he stopped it for one afternoon by tying off the tail vane, the only time in 19 years. He thought of selling. His brother Jan in Lancaster wrote that the millwright shop wanted him back. He sat for a winter alone, the wheel turning, the kettle whistling, the empty chair across the table. In the spring he untied the tail vane, and the wheel turned again, and he stayed. By the summer of 1879 the mill was 19 years old. He was 67, the wheel still turned, and the trough still overflowed at 600 gallons on a windy day, and the apple trees were tall enough to throw shade. That June, Hank Fenwick, 31 then, married to Sarah Cole, 4 children. The eldest, a boy named Thomas, who was 7, had reined his horse at the gate as Pieter greased the head bearing for the season. Still tinkering, Van Doren? When you gonna actually farm? Pieter, on the ladder, did not look down. He said, to the tower leg an inch from his face, "Wind word noit mo, a lean mensen." Hank, who did not speak Dutch, rode on. The drought began the next April. In the 13th month of the drought, 2 weeks before Hank Fenwick walked up the lane, Pieter heard the chatter again. It was a sound shaped like the one in 1875, but smaller and more patient. Tick-tick-tick under the wheel head at dawn, when the wind came up from the south. He stood beside the trough in his nightshirt with his head tilted. He had been waiting for that sound since he had failed to order the second spare set of weights in the year he had told himself he would. He knew exactly what it meant. 2 of the 4 governor weights were wearing on the pivot pins. If a pivot failed entirely in a strong wind, the wheel could not feather. In an afternoon thundergust, the blades could shear, and the head could come apart, and the system that had pumped 600 gallons a day for 19 years and 3 months could destroy itself before sundown. Out west, the heat thunderheads were stacking. He was 68 years old. He had not made the climb for a major repair since 1875, age 63, bones still young. He had told himself 2 springs ago that he was done with that climb forever. He looked up the 35 feet of his own tower and understood that he had been wrong. He went into the cabin and brought down the leather tool roll he had not unrolled in 5 years. The pipe wrench that had patina from 40 years of his father's hand and 20 more of his own. The spare governor weights from 1860. He had ordered 4 sets that year, with the Frisian forethought of a man whose father's notebook had outlived him. 2 sets had been used in 1875. 2 sets remained. He took 2 of the 4 spares and tied them into the tool sack with hemp twine. He tied off 2 ropes, one for himself at the harness loop, one for the tools. He put his foot on the first rung of the permanent cleat ladder he had built into the southwest leg in 1860. The ladder was 20 years old. The leather wrap on the second from top rung was rotted. He carried a 6-inch length of new harness leather to splice it on the way up. It took him 9 minutes to climb 35 feet. He had once done it in 5. His hands were gnarled, and the arthritis in his right thumb made the 3rd joint refuse to close all the way. He worked the wrench left-handed. At the head he braced his back against the tail vane and faced the centrifugal governor. The 2 worn pivot pins he had heard from below were egg-shaped where they should have been round. He pulled the cotter keys, slipped the worn weights free, and replaced them with the shining 1860 spares. He adjusted pivot tension by half a turn against the spring. He spun the assembly by hand and listened. The chatter was gone. 90 minutes at the head. 11 minutes climbing down. Slower. The body always returns to the ground more carefully than it leaves it. At the base, he sat on the bench and his hands shook. Halfway through the repair, hoofbeats on the road. Hank Fenwick had ridden past, looked up, and seen Pieter at 30 feet with the wrench in his hand. "Rusting up, Dutchman?" Hank had called. "Maybe time to sell while it still has parts." Hank had ridden on. Pieter had not answered. Hank's own well, although Hank did not know it yet, would go fully dry that night. Sarah Cole would tell him at supper. Sitting on the bench with his hands trembling, Pieter Van Doren, 68, sole, the last living member of his line in 2,000 miles, realized for the first time clearly that the windmill would outlast him, and that he had no apprentice. The wheel turned above him. The water came down. He had built a thing that worked, and there was no one yet to keep it working when his hands could no longer climb. He sat a long time at the trough and watched the sun pass the wheel, and began for the first time in 20 years to think about teaching. 2 weeks later, at midday, on the 14th month of the drought, a single figure appeared on the south road, walking, carrying something on his shoulder. Pieter was watering the apple saplings with the iron dipper. He saw the figure long before it reached the gate. It was Hank Fenwick. He was carrying his 8-year-old son, Thomas. Hank was on foot because his bay gelding had refused water 2 days running, and he had not had the cost of a bucket to give it for the round trip. Thomas was on his shoulder because the boy could no longer walk in the heat. The boy's mouth had cracked along the lower lip. Hank stopped at the gate and could not enter. Pieter set the dipper down on the trough rim. He did not move toward the gate. He let Hank stand. A full minute passed. The wheel turned. Thomas, on his father's shoulder, made a small dry sound, a cry without water in it. Hank's voice, when it came, was the voice of a man speaking through gravel. "My boy hasn't had clean water in 3 days, Mr. Van Doren." Pieter walked to the trough and dipped the wooden bucket. 5 gallons. He carried the bucket past Hank, not to, and to the boy. He did not hand the bucket to the father. He lifted the dipper to the child's lips himself. Thomas drank. His eyes closed. Pieter, watching only the boy, said quietly, "Wind never tires, Thomas. Only men do. Your grandfather Hendrik told that to me in the rain in Friesland when I was younger than you. Remember it." Thomas nodded against his father's neck. Hank's face came apart slowly, like a seam giving way. "I called you a fool for 20 years. Pieter, still looking at the boy, answered without anger. "You called my wife a fool too, Mr. Fenwick, when she stood beside me at the contract? She was not. Neither am I. Neither, perhaps, are you, if you can teach this boy what you would not learn yourself?" Hank could not answer above a whisper. "What do you ask? There is more water than I will ever drink. Bring your buckets. Bring Sarah's, bring the children's. I will fill them every morning for as long as the wind blows, which in this country, for this confined aquifer, is a long time. I ask only one thing. For 1 year, every night before bed, you tell Thomas exactly what happened today, the water and the silence and the man who waited. He will need that story when he is old enough to build his own. For how long must I tell it? Until he is 21? Then he will tell it to his own." Hank set Thomas down on the gatepost. He laid his hand on the wood of Pieter's gate as if it were the wood of a coffin. He nodded once. That afternoon 6 other families sent sons and daughters with clay jugs. Pieter filled every jug. The trough held. The wheel turned. 600 gallons that day, 600 the next, 600 the day after. The drought broke in the 3rd week of October with a 4-day rain that filled the dry creek to its banks for the first time in 15 months, but by then 14 claims had gone to J.W. Fenwick at his speculator price, and 22 more had sold half shares. 3 days after Hank's walk, J.W. Fenwick himself drove up the lane in his black buggy. He offered $16 an acre, 4 times his last offer, and the highest price ever bid on a western Kansas section. Pieter stood at the trough and watched the buggy. "This place was never for sale, Mr. Fenwick. It was for waiting." The buggy turned. The dust rose. The speculator wave that had taken 36 families that summer broke against 1 Halladay tower and 1 Dutch surname, and ran back to Wichita with its money in its pocket. Word ran ahead of the buggy across the county. Van Doren cannot be bought. By the next morning, 4 neighbors had put their land back on a different market at fair price to other farmers. The corner had turned. In the spring after the drought, Hank Fenwick rode up the lane on a borrowed mule with Thomas, then 9, behind him. Hank dismounted at the gate and stood the way he had stood the August before. "You said 1 year of teaching. I want 20. I want to learn what you learned. I want to put a mill on my own claim before this boy is grown." Peter looked at the boy, who looked back without flinching, and said, "Then come Saturdays." For 12 years, every Saturday, Thomas Fenwick rode from his father's place to Pieter Van Doren's. He learned the centrifugal governor. He learned the cable tool drilling sequence, hard pan, clay, sandstone casing. He learned the 4-spoke tile network and the 2% slope. He learned to read the wind by listening, and to listen for the chatter of a worn pivot before the wind found it. By the time he was 15, he could climb the 35 feet of the tower in 6 minutes and grease the head bearing better than Pieter could. Peter pumped, in his 32 years of solo ownership, approximately 7 million gallons of water through the brass cylinder. The total cost of the system at its build was $230, which divided by gallons over the system's life worked out to slightly more than 0.03 of a cent per gallon. The total hours of human labor required, summed across 32 years of greasing, governor swaps, and tower climbs, came to about 120 hours, which is 3 full weeks of a working life. The same volume of water, hand-pumped at the rate of 1 gallon per 4 strokes by a strong adult, would have required somewhere near 58,000 hours of labor, or roughly 6.5 years of full-time work. He had spent 20 years of his youth saving the price of the mill. He had been paid back 6.5 years of his back, and uncountable years of his nights. Pieter Van Doren died in November of 1893, at the age of 81, in his own bed, the wheel turning above him. Thomas, 21 then, inherited the claim by the will Pieter had quietly filed in Garden City a decade before. He worked the mill another 30 years. Hank Fenwick lived to 74. He kept his promise. He told Thomas the story of the August walk every night for 13 years, past the year Pieter asked into Thomas's manhood. In his old age, Hank became, of all unlikely things, the public defender of the windmill tradition against the early gas pump promoters, and was photographed in 1919 standing under the original Van Doren mill, which by then was the oldest continuously operating wind engine on the western Kansas High Plains. In 1920, a federal Department of Agriculture surveyor came through Finney County recording vanishing windmill traditions. He photographed Thomas's son, a boy named Pieter, born 1907, standing beside the still-turning wheel, 60 years after its first commissioning. The photograph hangs in a county library to this day. The phrase Hendrik Van Doren had spoken in the rain at Sneek in 1825, "Windward no white, mow." Aline Menson passed through his son to a single Kansas drought to a generation of farmers and into the working speech of the High Plains. By the late 1890s, a man could say of any task on his claim either that it was a wind tire's job, meaning a thing he had figured out how to make the world do for him forever, with patience and capital while he slept, or a man tire's job, meaning a thing that still cost his back. The right life, Pieter told Thomas one Saturday at the trough, was to spend the first half of it converting the second sort into the first. In your soil, in your climate, with the wind you actually have. Old farmers in Finney County still used the phrase in 1920. Some of them, in the dry years, still do. The wheel turned. The water came. Pieter Van Doren never patented anything. He invented nothing. The Halladay self-governing windmill was 29 years old when he drove the first stake of his tower into the western Kansas earth. What he did was harder. He spent 20 years of his back to buy a thing that would never need his back again, while every neighbor laughed at the cost. If you found yourself thinking about the patience of the man and the cleverness of the machine, please like and subscribe to our channel so the next story finds you. In the comments, tell us where you are watching from And if you have ever stood under an old windmill that is still turning, tell us the place. We would like to know. Thank you for watching. Quiet hands built this country, one wind tire's job at a time. The end.